So I've always said that the Kinks are my Beatles, and in a self-serving, have your cake and eat it way, the Beatles are also my Beatles. But what I mean by that is, for me, the Kinks have fulfilled a similar role in my musical life as the Beatles did, in that they had a solid decade plus of back-to-back classic albums and a run of singles that could rival anyone's in 60s rock. And yes, in my opinion, that does include the Beatles. They also similarly had very distinct early, middle and late phases of their career, and of course they made it beyond just the 60s, unlike the Beatles, who were selfish enough to break up. Sure, I would rather pour molten lava into my ears than listen to anything the Kinks released after about 1972, but I'm sure if the Beatles continued, I would more or less say the same. Let's not forget that the Beatles are considered the greatest band of all time precisely because they called it quits when they did. A rare feat in rock and roll, and one that ensured they couldn't tarnish their legacy, now and then notwithstanding. Also like the Beatles, it seemed as if the Kinks invented everything. Neanderthal riff rock and garage punk, austere Victoriana, Britpop, drone-infused psychedelia, and conceptual rock theatre. And were it not for a series of catastrophic strategic and commercial self-owns, I would argue it would be the Kinks and not the Rolling Stones who we would consider as the big number 2 band in the history of rock. But unlike the Beatles, the Kinks were not the result of some partnership between childhood friends. They were, of course, more of a family affair. And as the oldest son among a family of 8 children and a retiring creative genius, Ray Davies became the Kinks' reluctant patriarch, also a complete tyrant and depressive basket case, with the success of the band and its music weighing him down every bit as much as it fueled his creative fires. And as we know from other family-based bands like the Beach Boys, the Jackson 5 and the Bee Gees, for them it's more like being in the mafia than being in a band. You cannot simply leave the family when the going gets tough. You are stuck with each other through thick and thin. And to go one further, there is something uniquely toxic about the rivalry between 2 brothers, with Ray and Dave Davies providing a direct blueprint for the ever-feuding Liam and Noel Gallagher. In fact, for my money, the mutual animosity between the Davies brothers has historically been far worse, with backstage bickering erupting into onstage violence not just regularly, but almost constantly, especially throughout the 1970s. At the time of recording, I am convinced that the only reason either Ray or Dave are still alive right now is to spite the other. Ray Davies cuts such a fascinating figure because he thinks what he thinks, he says what he says, and cares not one iota for what everyone else thinks of him or anything else. He is famously moody, bitchy, and miserly, to the point of being mean. He is not ashamed to stipulate very clearly to journalists that they are paying for lunch if they want to interview him, despite being a multi-millionaire. And it's not an act. And I would go so far as to say that even aside from his official bipolar disorder diagnosis, the man is a bona fide prick. And I love him for it. It strikes me as a rather naive modern phenomenon that we all insist our idols have to be nice people on a personal level. 1, as if we can ever really know, and 2, as if it matters. What does matter, of course, is the art they put into the world, and very often creativity is a byproduct of an otherwise unstable mind, as we all know. Not even unstable necessarily, I just mean we all contain multitudes. Believe it or not, even I can be a bit of an asshole sometimes, and I'm sure you can too. John Lennon, Miles Davis, Lou Reed were all assholes, but are they any less legendary for it? I don't think so. Then on the other hand, can you really be so sure that Taylor Swift, Dave Grohl or Paul McCartney are really as nice as we're led to believe? I doubt it, except for Paul maybe. At the end of the day, Ray Davies doesn't care what anyone thinks of him, which in the current era of hyper-image management and rock legacy curation puts him very much at odds with his peers and is probably the biggest reason that the Kinks are at risk of being mostly lost to time. He has never cared very much for how his work is presented as long as he is, somewhere along the line, getting paid. And when he is gone, I suspect he will care even less. And you know what? Good. Ray Davies would not have it any other way. Out of principle, he refuses to conform. He's not like everybody else. Also related to the Kinks' uncertain legacy is the fleeting nature of time itself, a concept key to understanding the Kinks and Ray's songwriting. It's not just that they are rock's men out of time, then and now, but it's also why I would argue that their records sound the way they do and why their music can so often be exhilarating as well as heartbreakingly sad. As for the sound, that also comes back to Ray's inherent frugality and the nature of the industry in the early to mid-60s. Early on, when their records were at their rawest and most lo-fi, it was because they were naturally recording quickly in cheap studios, which is one thing. But then when it came to repackaging their material for compilations or even classic album re-releases down the track, original masters were so often lost or poorly remastered, and Ray had little problem signing off any of it, as I understand. So while it's often thrilling to hear material from other classic 60s bands cleaned up and remastered for modern ears, with the Kinks I would argue that the opposite is true. Something about listening to a copy of a copy of a copy of a song hastily recorded in some Denmark Street backroom all these years later makes the Kinks' music sound eerie and out of time, with Ray's ghostly music hall voice poking out of a wall of distortion and echo, very often enhanced in no small part by the historically unrecognised vocal contributions of his then-wife, Rasa, of whom I will speak more about later. And because the Kinks have only recently managed to just about start doing a good job of remastering their own material, possibly the result of Ray losing more and more control of these things in advanced old age, personally, I don't think that it chimes with how we collectively think, or should collectively think, of the Kinks. The Kinks are a band best understood in the then and not the now, so it stands to reason that their music should reflect that. Their lyrics certainly do. Telling stories is of course how we understand the world. As Ray sang in 1968, people take pictures of each other just to prove that they really existed. I believe in the song, people take pictures of each other. Because Ray's thing is fiercely everyman and proletarian. He doesn't dress up his lyrics with fancy long words and tortured metaphors, or at least he didn't until the Kinks went theatrical much later on, and he temporarily at least lost some of his common touch. But nonetheless, my point is, his stories are for the most part simple and relatable, which is why so many people, like myself, really feel the emotional pull of these songs. Which is perhaps why, after he had virtually conquered the idea of making the perfect single several times over, and I really mean that, the man has disproportionately composed so many of the best pop songs ever written. Eventually, his chosen method for evolving his art was to pull lots of similarly straightforward and sympathetic human stories into something long-form, the dreaded rock opera. Now, I don't have the time here to really explain why I think Tommy is not very good. I'm saving that for the Who episode. But I will try to argue that Arthur is basically the Kinks' single best long player in spite of its concept, and not because of it. In fact, conceptually at least, Village Green is better because it's more thematic than linear, even if I think its songs aren't quite as good as Arthur's. And while it took the Kinks many more years of ups and downs before they went fully overboard with the bloated vaudeville theatre era, Arthur marks a sweet spot where these songs still came first over and above the concept, where they could equally stand alone as they could also convey a story, and the band was still young, hungry and weird enough for the music to still be raw, exciting, and moreover, poignant. My earliest memory of the Kinks was the inclusion of All Day and All of the Night on the soundtrack of the 90s ITV police procedural drama Heartbeat. My parents had it on CD before I think we even had a CD player. Perhaps as Louie Louie also did for millions of young people around the world, All Day and All of the Night really set something off inside of me and is probably the moment I fell in love with rock and roll proper. Not just because of its incredible riff and escalating harmonic shifts, but mostly because of how raw and wild it sounds, even now. And a bunch of their early tracks are exactly like this. If you don't like the early Kinks, then you don't like rock and roll, frankly. But it was much later, perhaps a good 15 years later, that I picked up a copy of Village Green Preservation Society on CD while visiting Sydney for some reason. I think because I had heard Tim Rogers of UMI talking about it. And that's when all the dominoes fell and I really fell in love with the Kinks and began collecting everything I could get my hands on, legally or otherwise, mostly otherwise. And then in my impoverished student days, something else became a staple for me and my housemates, who I also played in a band with, seemingly appropriate for what felt like a gritty life on the Never Never. So then, after almost a decade of near-total Kinks obsession, I found myself lucky enough to live in London, North London no less, the Kinks' cradle, with a K, as it were. And initially, you'd better believe that the Kinks and Village Green specifically were soundtracking my early days in this city. cycling through the leafy streets of Islington or marvelling at the day-glow tidy town quaintness of the city's unending suburban enclaves and town centres from the top deck of a London Routemaster bus. And then for a time when we lived in Kentish Town, where I was close enough to Archway and Holloway to experience the actual London of Ray Davies songs, including more than one spell house-sitting in Muswell Hill, an area now considered impossibly bourgeois for us mere mortals. I did of course take my time to check out Denmark Terrace where they grew up. I've never been lucky enough to bump into Ray or Dave while living here, but their presence is certainly still felt today, even if their London seems long gone. But it was around this time that I decided to join the official Kinks fan club. Now, I had never joined any kind of fan club before, and I perhaps naively thought that now that I lived in Kinks territory, I might be ushered into a secret society of like-minded people, maybe even hip young people like me who just got it, you know? But alas, time played another of its little tricks, and when I finally got to the annual Kinks convention with a K of course, at the Dome in Tufnell Park, I was a little bit disappointed that the event was little more than a few trestle tables of old Kinks memorabilia and an army of divorced phomotic baldies swaying unsteadily to a Kinks tribute act that, other than Mick Avery himself, included a seemingly endless stream of geriatric bassists and keyboard players who had at one point or another played with the Kinks during the 20 or so years of their career that, in all fairness, few people are really interested in. Sorry. All my life I've been into music that older people liked, so I shouldn't really have been surprised. But it dawned on me then just how long ago the 60s really was, and that this whole culture that I adored was fading away to time. I mean, McCartney, Jagger and Dylan probably have the blood of young children available to keep them going, but the rest of the old guard are off solid food at this point. And this was nearly 10 years ago at the time of recording. Still, I drank my real ale and convinced myself that this was, after all very fitting, because being a Kinks fan is all about acknowledging the passing of time, and with it, the melancholia and odd sense of pride that comes alongside it. And finally, I got the chance to drag my wife along to Sunny Afternoon, the West End musical about the Kinks, and despite my reservations, it was incredibly good. And this, as well as hungrily reading through A Complicated Life, Johnny Rogan's exhaustingly comprehensive biography of Ray, in a way, it kind of completed my Kinks journey, got it mostly out of my system. And to this day, the Kinks are a band I love, but I only occasionally dip back into. Kind of like the Small Faces and the Who, when I'm craving just a bit of that warm nostalgia of swinging 60s London. Nonetheless, that said, like the Beatles, the music of the Kinks makes up a big part of who I am, and that's true whether I keep them front of mind or not. This is my street, and I'm never gonna leave it, and I'm always gonna stay here till I live to be 99. So I figured that walking through the entirety of the Kinks' lengthy career would take too long, and it's mostly unnecessary, as I'm sure most people watching this will at least know their early hits. So I thought it might instead be more interesting to tell their story in relation to some specific aspects of Ray's writing through some of my favourite Kinks songs, or at least my favourite ones that are less well known, slightly at least. And it's worth noting that the Kinks' biggest hits are all incredible, and I will never ever get sick of hearing them, which is something I can't always say about the Beatles. So we all know the Davies brothers grew up in the district of Fortis Green in Muswell Hill, in a large working-class family steeped in music of all kinds. Their first lineup formed somewhere around 1962 with school friend Peter Quaife on bass, and by the time Mick Avery had joined, they had settled on a permanent name in the Kinks, which is admirably subversive considering the time period and the name's deliberate connotations. Not entirely unrelated to their personally fluid attitudes towards sexuality in their songs and their lives, especially Dave's. They signed to Pie Records in 1964, and their third single, You Really Got Me, finally broke through, and the Kinks became a very serious concern indeed. For sheer raw energy, it eclipses anything the Beatles, the Stones, or anyone else was doing in Britain at the time, for my money. And being the shrewd operator he is, Ray quite rightly recognised a winning formula when he heard it, which is why so many of their early tunes are basically rewrites of You Really Got Me. And I mean that in the best possible way. Because the formula here, other than the sound of the record, which can be boiled down to the involvement of producer Shel Talmy, the use of session drummers instead of Mick Avery, and the likely apocryphal tale of Dave Davies slashing his guitar amplifier speaker cone with a knife to get the requisite distortion for his guitar, is the combination of direct, to the point, basic lyrics, and through generating excitement with the use of key changes in the song. So when You Really Got Me, it goes from the key of G, and then builds excitement by going a tone up to the key of A. Yeah, you really got me now, and then eventually up to D. And then in a song like All Day and All the Night, we've got the same thing, also in the key of G. Going from there to by your side, going up again a tone to A. And up to D. The exact same trick. And then there's I Need You, which is a lesser known banger from the earlier period that more or less does the same thing again. Started from G, I need you. Then it goes up to A to build the excitement. If you ever tell me goodbye, I'll break down and you'll hear me cry. I need you, up a whole octave. Don't anybody else and needed anyone before. Yet another track that repeats this trick is Everybody's Gonna Be Happy, and likely countless others from the first few years of their career. A personal favourite of their raucous rock and roll period for me also is Till the End of the Day. Interesting in that, yes, it's also riff rock perfection, but its minor key gives it an underlying edge of darkness, suggesting that Ray's lust for life, as expressed in the lyric, comes with a tongue in the cheek, if not a gun to the head. Oh baby, I feel good from the moment I rise. Feel good from the morning to the end of the day. Something also about the verse of this song which is just so much fun to play as a rhythm guitarist. Makes me think I would love nothing more than to be a Dave Davis in a Kinks cover band. Just how joyous it is to play all this stuff. And on top of that, it's worth saying I think Dave Davis is an excellent guitarist for what the Kinks are, and he is severely undervalued and underappreciated as a 60s guitar god. It also makes it all the more baffling that then session man Jimmy Page played on so many of their early tracks, to the point that it's now unclear what is him and what is Dave. As well as the Kinks frequently using session musicians, their first 3 albums, at least those released originally in the UK and are therefore considered canon, are also products of their time, which is to say they are more or less vehicles for their singles, padded out with covers and with the album tracks not typically produced with the same attention to rawness and power that the singles of the time were. Naturally. Nothing unusual for the time. Ray really hit his songwriting stride and started shitting miracles with 1966's Face to Face, which for me is the point where their albums really start becoming coherent and worthy of study. And it marks the point where Ray distinctly dropped the riff rock in favour of 2 new types of song, the novelty song and the melancholy mid-tempo ballad. Now, novelty songs usually annoy me when they are done by the Beatles, the Small Faces or the Who. But I can't think of any artist who so thoroughly folded the novelty song into their style as effectively as the Kinks. Probably because they are so unself-conscious and laced with irony and social satire. Early on, this came in the amusing form of songs like the Cod Calypso, I'm on an Island, and Sitting on My Sofa, a song about, you guessed it, sitting on your sofa. On Face to Face, they do daft, cutesy music hall in songs like Dandy or Session Man, and they put out several iconic singles in this vein also with Dedicated Follower of Fashion and Mr. Pleasant around this time. Songs that sound ridiculously dated now, even if the lyrics still have a real satirical bite to them. Something he also continued to do at this time, like he did with the band's early riff rock singles, was effectively rewrite the same song again and again. And far from being a negative, the fact that Sunny Afternoon, Dead End Street and Autumn Almanac are conceptually more or less the same doesn't take anything away from the fact that they are indeed all absolutely perfect songs. In fact, some of Autumn Almanac is simply a different Kinks song played backwards, according to Ray. Such was his habit of recycling ideas. In 1967, at the height of Technicolor flower power psychedelia, the Kinks predictably went against the grain with the austere black and white Victoriana of Something Else, again laden with deliberately English twee songs like Tin Soldier Man and Afternoon Tea. But where Ray really came into his own here is with the mid-tempo melancholy ballad, and perhaps his single greatest achievement in this direction is of course the immortal Waterloo Sunset. The song described by hugely influential music critic Robert Christgau as the most beautiful song in the English language, and it's pretty hard to argue with that. As a Londoner, I don't think there's a single better way to experience and understand this city than to travel south across Waterloo Bridge, as I did almost every day for several years, with the sad majesty of Waterloo sunset ringing in your ears. The mood of lonely optimism that Ray captures in that song is really impossible to accurately describe, and he thinks it sucks. An enormous and unrecognised aspect of so many of the Kinks' most iconic period in the mid to late 60s is the presence of his wife Rasa on backing vocals. Indeed, she was their secret sauce. A German-born Lithuanian whose family fled the Soviet Union to their new home in England, Rasa Didzpetris married Ray in 1964, and her ghostly high harmonies are all over the Kinks records of this time. The degree to which she also contributed to the band's songs compositionally is the subject of much debate. And the breakup of her marriage to Ray in 1973, Ray's notorious stinginess, and the prevailing sexist culture of the time means that she was unfortunately more or less airbrushed out of the Kinks' history. What is certain is that she was quite hard done by, and I really don't think it's a coincidence that Ray's greatest work occurred when he was collaborating, one way or the other, with his wife. She was also the inspiration behind one of my favourites and an early example of Ray's uncanny ability to capture sadness and longing, his 1965 demo for I Go to Sleep.
Though you are far away, I know you'll always be near to me. I go to sleep, sleep, and imagine that you're there with me.
There's really something in the way the music so perfectly reflects the theme of the lyric, a consistent feature of Ray's songwriting, and extremely powerful in that he will very often shift gears mid-song in a way that is as disarming as it is emotionally devastating.
You took my life, but then I knew that very soon you'd leave me. But it's alright, now I'm not frightened of this world, believe me. I wish today could be tomorrow. The night is dark, it just brings sorrow, let it weigh.
That song, their 1968 single Days, marked the end of Ray's perfect run of singles, with the later exception of Lola, with its somewhat surprise success. And around this time, the Kinks' albums were failing to capture the record-buying public. It's worth saying as well that as a performing entity, the Kinks were blacklisted in the US between 1965 and 1969 over union issues, and Ray had his first major nervous breakdown in 1966. From a songwriting perspective, both of these events caused Ray to look ever inward for inspiration. While not a through-and-through concept album, Sgt. Pepper kind of blew the doors off in the previous year as far as normalising the idea of the album as a piece of high art. So while the Kinks' 1968 masterpiece, The Kinks Are the Village Green Preservation Society, doesn't exactly try to tell a story, it is very much a collection of songs based around a singular theme, and I personally think it's all the better for it. And even if it more or less completely bombed on release in 1968, the way it so perfectly captures the mood of inward-looking nostalgia is the reason it is so highly regarded as the hipster Kinks album of choice. And with good reason. In fact, my angle for this video was always going to be Arthur is better than Village Green, mostly for clickbait reasons. And ahead of time, I dreamed up a few justifications for taking that position. But just to refresh myself for writing this, I happened to walk my dog around Clissold Park while listening to Village Green, and its amazingness kind of threw a spanner into my plans. There's really no other way to put it. Village Green really is just so good. I do genuinely like Arthur more, but there's barely a cigarette paper between them. I remember the opening track grabbing me instantly when I first heard it. I would even say within the first 30 seconds, the listener can get immediately what the album is, conceptually, so concise that it is. Do You Remember Walter is a personal favourite of mine on this record, a superficially jaunty arrangement that is underneath a devastating comment on lost friendships over time.
I bet you're fat and married and you're always home in bed by 8:30. And if I talked about the old times, you get bored and you'd have nothing more to say. Yes, people often change, but memories of people can remain.
That last line there basically summarising the entire premise of Village Green. The idea of the world as you know it, slipping through your fingers. And we are left only with snapshots, fleeting memories of people and places long gone. So maybe we'd be wise to savour them more than we perhaps do. The next track, Picture Book, is a lot of fun and obviously carries on with this theme and was subsequently ripped off by both Green Day and Mac DeMarco. Johnny Thunder was ripped off by Paul Weller of The Jam, and in all fairness, it and the next track, The Last of the Steam-Powered Trains, were going to be examples of weaker tracks that personally I don't quite enjoy as much as the others. They are nonetheless thematically and musically pretty top-notch, even if I don't quite jive with them as much. Big Sky is a lovely bit of Ogden's Nut Gone Flake style psych. I won't go on too much more other than to say that Animal Farm and the song Village Green itself really represent the heart of this album, and as ever, these seemingly novel and purposeful songs are laced with a desperate sadness.
I miss the village green and all the simple people. I miss the village green, the church, the club, the steeple. I miss the morning dew, fresh air and Sunday school. And
Overall, Village Green really captures a small-town, parochial, small-c conservatism that of course was never going to play well with the hippie generation. And I suppose personally, it took me a long time to understand that a band of working-class socialists might take this position, such as the meaning of these terms shifted over the years. But subtlety and nuance do not make bank, and the Kinks' other Village Green Preservation Society marked the beginning of a decade-long commercial slump for the band, at least as far as album sales were concerned. While it was not helped in any small part by Ray pulling the release at the last minute over track listing concerns and its lack of an obvious single, its failure said more about the Kinks as men out of time, with a long-haired, pot-smoking public showing little enthusiasm for songs about steam trains, China cups and virginity. Additionally, it was eventually released literally on the same day as the Beatles' blockbuster White Album and about a week before the Stones' Beggar's Banquet, which didn't help. And further to that, the Kinks in the public consciousness were simply not considered serious, zeitgeisty heavy hitters like the Stones or the Beatles anyway. Of course, it's now considered their greatest effort in many quarters, and incredibly, eventually, due to its cult status, their bestseller. But at the time, it must have felt like the Kinks were lurching from disaster to disaster, with original bassist Peter Quaife permanently leaving the band about 4 months after Village Green's release to be replaced by John Dalton, who had previously filled in for Pete following a car accident in 1966, and therefore was an obvious choice for the role. Now The Who broke through to the big time with Tommy in 1969, an album I have never much cared for, despite knowing its songs back to front for my sins. I had wrongly been led to believe that the vibe of Tommy was that showcased in the film Almost Famous, but it turns out Sparks is really the only transcendent, psychedelic moment on that record, in my opinion, and the rest of it, to my mind at least, is made up of bridging novelty songs that clumsily attempt to connect up disparate parts of its already nonsensical, confused plot. Extra, extra, read all about it. Tommy is a div, but it's not his fault. And his uncle is a pedo, and he's somehow good at pinball, and he's also somehow Jesus. To be honest, I can't think of many rock operas that I enjoy, mostly because I've always felt a linear story told over the course of an album kind of goes against the rawness, variety, and spontaneity that I mostly enjoy about rock and roll. And perhaps what saves Arthur, to my mind at least, is that as far as the concept is concerned, it was actually intended to soundtrack a television program, so its songs therefore are more thematic than literal. As a result, each song stands on its own as well as forms part of a wider, loose narrative, and I think it's safe to say that, as presented, this isn't linear on Arthur anyway, because they've clearly prioritised flow in the track listing, as well as other considerations like side length and all that. Ray was first introduced to the world of TV and film through producer Ned Sherrin and was matched with playwright Julian Mitchell to put together a musical drama chronicling the fall of the British Empire from the reign of Queen Victoria to the then present. Now, the Edwardian chic of Lord Kitchener and Aubrey Beardsley was still very much part of the British psychedelic aesthetic at the time, so I don't think the concept is anywhere near as regressive as Village Green's, despite how we might compare the albums today in terms of thematic continuity, of which there is admittedly a lot. As ever, there is so much of Ray himself in the story and the songs, and the decision of he and Dave's older sister Rose to move to Australia in 1964 with her husband Arthur had already inspired several songs in the Kinks canon. With Rose's husband as direct inspiration, the album's character of Arthur Morgan, a name instantly familiar to Red Dead Redemption fans, is a working-class carpet layer stung by the loss of his brother in the Battle of the Somme during the First World War. During the interwar period, Arthur does what society demands, marrying Rose, raising children and securing his very own paradise in the suburbs of London. All the while, the England Arthur once knew seems further and further away, and as an old man he is left wondering what he has lost in his pursuit of the dream. Then, with his son's decision to emigrate his family to the supposed paradise of Australia, Arthur is left stranded in his Shangri-La, caught between the old world and the new. So the backdrop of the British Empire's gradual decline is conceptually far bigger than Village Green's inspecific parochialism. And its significance is not lost on me, not just as I am indeed from the colonies myself, but also I immigrated to the UK on the eve of the 2016 EU referendum. And it took me until well after the Leave vote came in for me to truly understand the psychology behind the result, and even sympathise with this collective desire to harken back to a perceived, earlier, simpler time. I mean, sure, it's a running joke among millennials that boomers act as if they literally fought in the Second World War, and I might add, the silent generation, who of course did, overwhelmingly supported a big state with free healthcare, welfare, good education, and all the things embodied by the post-war consensus. However, I do appreciate the privations the boom generation suffered in the austerity years, and also how seismic the Allied victory was in the public consciousness, especially if viewed as the sort of last gasp of the fading empire. It's human nature to yearn for the world as it was in your youth, even if the material reality at the time wasn't all wine and roses. Ray is speaking to that same inclination here, of course from the perspective of 1969, when such sentiment was far fresher than it might be now. And while his chronicling of the decline of the British Empire from the Victorian era through to the then present day is absolutely tinged with his own trademark backward-looking sadness, I don't think, at least through any explicit suggestion in these songs, that this, however, comes at the expense of progress either. Let's not forget Ray Davies himself composed a song to celebrate the UK's entry into the European communities in 1973. So I think the album's backdrop of declining empire, at least, is less a comment from Ray and more of an observation for starters. And that aside, the politics of the Kinks and the politics of this album, as well as Village Green, is something I could never quite square until I spent nearly a decade living in merry old England myself. Initially, I couldn't quite fathom how a working-class band, steeped in the British socialist tradition, and I'm not suggesting working-class people are more inclined to be either left or right-wing, then or now, might also harbour these seemingly small-c conservative views as espoused by Ray Davies on these records, that put so much value in tradition and so feared change, at least at face value. And the reason I couldn't understand that is that as a millennial for whom advancements like the internet embody, or at least did when I was coming of age, progress, I had wrongly been led to believe that technological, economic and social development is all by its very nature part of the same progressive forward march. I realise now, especially now, that the global right have so thoroughly embraced the futuristic technologies embodied by AI and modern space exploration, that progress one way or another is not prima facie, by default, a good thing necessarily. After all, the Luddites didn't reject automation because they were simply scared of the future. They were scared for their livelihoods, and rightly so. So even if our main character Arthur is your everyman archetype who feels overwhelmed and alienated by the trappings of the modern world and pines for a simpler, earlier time, even if he was then materially worse off in that time, I can absolutely recognise that attitude today in the British psyche, and perhaps I even share a little bit of it. And at least what Arthur and Village Green of course try to explain, or perhaps allude to, is the interlocking histories, movements and cultures that make these seemingly contradictory, non-linear, stochastic positions possible. For example, this is why there is a small but significant faction of environmental conservationists within the wider British conservative movement. Or why racism partially fueled the union movement on the left, at least in the early days. Today, for example, there are also large segments of the UK population who are economically progressive and socially conservative, and vice versa. We all contain multitudes. This is what it is to be human, and Ray Davies is nothing if he is not a humanist. And that shines through, particularly in Arthur's many songs about war, including literal references to the First or Second World Wars. Either way, the working class are being sent off to die, is the message. As a topic for the hip British sounds of the late 60s, something must have been in the air, as both the Zombies, Odyssey and Oracle, and the Pretty Things rock opera SF Sorrow contain songs about the Great War at the very least. And Ray is by both turns romantic about that, as well as bitterly sardonic about the human cost of war. Songs like Yes Sir, No Sir, and Mr. Churchill Says serve a function in Arthur's story, of course, but while Arthur, as Ray's analogue, might be willing to kill and be killed for the country and life that he loves, he's more than a bit bothered to be doing so on the orders of some officer-class toff. I might add as well that this is a sentiment well drilled into the Australian consciousness, such as the disastrous World War I Gallipoli campaign cloyingly lionised in Australian culture, rightly or wrongly. But Arthur's war is never over, and in peacetime his battlefield is instead the boardroom, the gentleman's club, or the suburban street where he fights tooth and nail for the ultimate victory, social status. As ever, we return to class as the underpinning driver of British society, where all the consumer rewards in the world can't overcome your given lot in life, nor can it dull your sharpened elbows or remove that chip from your shoulder. And to this theme, Ray's lyrics are fiercely proletarian, clever but never lofty. He never talks down to his audience, nor does he sneer at the subjects of his songs, like Blur does. Instead, he sympathises. Arthur himself, in the then-present day of 1969, is a man in his 70s, and Ray has written an entire rock opera using this old man as a vector for analysing how the events of the 20th century shape the lives of small, ordinary people in the Anglosphere. No wonder Arthur failed to successfully capture the hippie zeitgeist when Pete Townshend was countering this with pinball wizards, acid queens, and whatever other flashy nonsense. In another contrast to Tommy, and again partly a function of Arthur being largely written to soundtrack a television program, I would also say that Ray is crediting his audience with a high degree of intelligence, such that it is that the songs of Arthur scarcely attempt to lay out very much of an explicit narrative. He's asking you to interpret it yourself. He's showing, not telling. And he does this through the music as well. Like their lyrics, the Kinks' music is always direct, designed to carry the emotion of the lyrics and nothing more, with a single jammy and thoroughly enjoyable exception on this record. And I will argue that, track by track, that the marriage of music and lyrics on each track of Arthur is so immaculately synergized, so completely made for each other, that you could be forgiven for thinking either they have existed forever, were designed by algorithm, or were otherwise immaculately conceived. There's no process in them, you cannot see the joins, you cannot remove an element from the whole. It doesn't mean that you have to like it all necessarily, but it does mean that it's more or less impossible to argue that they should have been written and recorded any differently from how they were. This is indeed a trait that the Kinks share with the Beatles. But in addition to this seamlessness is a perhaps then current willingness to play with the form as far as song structure is concerned. King Crimson's debut aside, in 1969 we are yet still a few years off proper progressive rock, and 1969 was more or less the middle of post-Sgt. Pepper era of experimentation that at the very least made space for stretching out otherwise conventional song forms. And not just in terms of noodly blues jamming, but instead songs that might start with a typical repeating verse-chorus format, come to some kind of natural resolve, and then start off in another direction entirely before returning to familiar territory later on. And not in a way a bridge might function in a conventional song structure either. I mean proper tempo changes, key changes, and shifts in tone, usually with their own internal logic and structure, more often than not meant to represent a shift of perspective in the lyrics between characters. There are at least 5 songs that do this on Arthur, and virtually none that do this on Village Green. It's very deliberate, intended to serve the lyrics, and only hints at the kind of compositional complexity we would be getting from the mainstream rock of your Queens and your Led Zeppelins in only a few short years from 1969. That said, here it's still all very pop and succinct, with few of Arthur's tracks breaching the 5-minute mark, and most of them scarcely exceeding 3. Musically, Arthur navigates a fairly diverse and uniquely British stylistic gamut, that includes mid-tempo sing-along grooves, austere ballads, musical novelty songs, multi-part proto-progressive epics, and hard drivin', hard riffin', capital R rock. The latter being the album's only nod to the contemporary Hendrixian heaviness of the late 60s, perhaps in response to the failure of Village Green and that record's distinct lack of heaviness. But let's not forget, this is the Kinks after all, the band who invented Neanderthal garage rock on their iconic breakthrough singles. These guys can rock if required. I would say as well that something the Kinks share with other acts of rock's first wave like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, but definitely not The Who in the very same year hit it big off the back of their incendiary, if under par, appearance at Woodstock, is that, as a live act, the Kinks simply weren't much chop. Seeing them play live in 1965, I would of course been soiling my knickers just like any other self-respecting pop-crazed teeny bopper, but by 69 and after Hendrix and Cream, and especially Led Zeppelin, so thoroughly raised the bar in terms of virtuosity, if you weren't in the face-melting business, you were in no business at all. Outside of middle-of-the-road pop dreck for squares. And onstage fisticuffs aside, as a fairly inconsistent and limp live concern, the Kinks were never going to fit squarely into either of those round holes. That said, I would like to say that Dave Davies is the most underrated classic rock era guitarist I can think of. Like George Harrison, perhaps even more so. His parts are thoughtful, iconic, and they really lift the songs, as do his distinctive backing vocals alongside Rasa's. And unlike George Harrison, this guy could shred. Sure, he might not be up there with Jimmy Page or whatever, but he's at least up there with Keith Richards and maybe even Pete Townsend. Someone who admits to copying Dave's entire style, at least initially. But aside from Dave, as a group, they just never had the sauce. But what they still had, just about, was the fortuitous combination of relative youth and the ability to utilize the limitations of analog technology in their favor. Which is to say, in 1969, relentless touring and a toxic interband atmosphere had not yet totally dulled their energy for playing like it might do later on, and before relocating to northwest London's Morgan Studios on their next few albums, and eventually building their own studio, Konk, in 1973, they were still recording in the cheap and cheerful Pi Studios in London's West End, where they had recorded all 6 of their previous albums and their biggest hits. So for that reason, Arthur represents the last gasp of the Kinks' early iconic sound. The sound which each and every person who has ever heard You Really Got Me instantly fell in love with. Ray had also assumed the role of producer from Village Green going forward, as he would do through to the release of their last album as a group in 1994. So while what unites Village Green and Arthur, as far as the sound is concerned, is this fundamental, primitive garage sound that so also defined the 60s portion of the Kinks' career, instrumentationally, where they differ is the use of strings, or string sounds at least, on Village Green versus the use of horns or brass on Arthur. Chosen primarily for budgetary reasons to avoid the cost of hiring string players, the mellotron and, to a slightly lesser degree, the harpsichord on Village Green really solidifies that album's place in the late 60s Psych Hall of Fame, alongside albums by the Beatles, the Zombies and the Moody Blues. Arthur, on the other hand, while striving for something sonically larger perhaps, and more ambitious, instead opts for horns in a way that gives it quite a different sound, despite being recorded in such similar circumstances only mere months apart. It does also contain string parts on a handful of tracks, real ones for the most part, but the brass arrangements dominate the album's embellishments outside of the Kinks' own standard rock band instrumentation, and point towards the sound they would pursue in the following decade, actually taking a horn section out on the road with them on the regular, as well as lending a hint of music hall novelty and an epic air of wartime triumphalism across Arthur's key tracks, something the horn players do on this album as well as peppered throughout the band's 60s catalogue in particular, is add touches of ironic oompa band absurdity to their music that is sometimes absurd, sometimes psychedelic and thoroughly British. Like the power riff, distorted guitars or proto-Britpop, it's just another Kinksian innovation, a part of their sound that makes their classic era output so instantly recognisable. Something I really like about the opening seconds of both Arthur and Village Green is how unassuming they are. The Kinks are announcing their arrival, but not trying to blow your head off. Their sound is immediately more cutesy, welcoming, and tiny town than that, like an 80s stop-motion kids' TV show or something. A jaunty little number, Victoria shuffles into frame by introducing its central melody on the guitar before the vocals come in, prefacing the main body of the song just as the song itself prefaces the album. Long ago, life was green, sex was bad, cold obscene, and the rich were so mean. Stately homes for the lords, croquet lawns, village greens, Victoria was my queen. Aside from literally already mentioning village greens, the song itself is not a million miles away from that album's opening track either, in that Ray is immediately espousing the virtues of chastity, probity, and in this case, the out-of-control inequality of the Victorian era, with more than a little tongue in the old cheek, of course, in relation to that. We're all happy little serfs in this little kingdom, whistle while you work kind of stuff. And even then, he is at once talking about Victoria as an era, as well as the monarch's literal name at that time, and a symbol of the empire as seen around the world, with namesake colonial outposts in Canada, the Seychelles, and Australia, the state of Victoria, of course, being my home state. This is the frame or the mindset that Arthur's story takes place within, and no characters are mentioned here as they are later on the record. Not the Victorian era itself, of course, but a new 20th century era where Victoriana loomed large in the public consciousness, and the empire as previously known was slowly slipping through the fingers of its subjects. Victoria is just the beginning of the titular decline, as it were. I love Dave's nasal guitar tone in the verses, contrasting with the expansiveness of the arpeggiated guitar parts in the chorus.
Victoria, Victoria, Victoria.
By the second verse, the song's danceable groove becomes irresistible, and the addition of horns leading into the song's majestic halftime bridge. There's a real contrast between the smallness of the verses detailing the protagonist's life, Ray's or Arthur's to be fair, and the grandness of that bridge, symbolising the overarching theme of empire. But we don't get to bask in that for too long, as we're treated to an economic guitar solo from Dave, and I love how from here to the song's finish, how much you can hear him screaming his head off mic. Such is the joyous nature of the band's performance. All the good and the bad and the great and the good of Britishness, capsulized in just over 3.5 minutes. The resigned yet regimented forward march of Mick Avery's kit introduces Yes Sir, No Sir, with the acoustic guitar part again providing an appropriate, unassuming introduction to this World War I epic about working class obsequiousness in the face of authority. Yes sir, no sir. Where do I go, sir? What do I do, sir? What do I say? There's a very nifty melodic trick in the chord pattern here, starting in G, then for the second half of the verse lifts up to B.
Yes sir, no sir. Where do I go, sir? What do I do, sir? What do I say?
There's some obscenely raw lead guitar work from Dave underneath that before it goes into the So You Think That You've Got Ambition section. Still in B flat, making the return to G for the second verse sound as if we've made a key change, even though we're exactly back where we started. Back in the military parade, as it were. Chest out, stomach in. Do what I say. We've by now shifted into the perspective of the drill sergeant who was levelling with these lads by explaining that no amount of bootlicking or heroics will elevate them above their current status. The horns have well and truly arrived by the second verse, and after the ABA format of the song so far, it actually changes pace entirely for section C. The lyric drilling in further how stuck Arthur and his brother are among the rank and file. So of course, this has already become a tin pot multi-part epic, and changing tempo yet again into the D section, the ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba part emphasises the almost comical folly of this predicament. Ray's voice further switches into the plummy accent of the politician directing the officer class. Let them feel that they're important to the cause, but let them know that they are fighting for their homes. Just be sure that they're contributing their all.
Give the scum a gun and make the bugger fight. And be sure to have deserters shot on sight. If he dies, we'll send a medal to his wife.
With that, the song's characters cackle in hysterics, haw-hawing drunkenly to the la 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 la, arm in arm, kick dancing over the top, out of the trenches and into no man's land and certain death. It's macabre, hilarious, and devastating, all at once. We then return to a final verse, exactly where we started really, perhaps with a new set of fresh-faced recruits helplessly resigned to their fates. He even sings, "Please let me die, sir." Such is the Python-esque absurdity of the situation. Having set up the First World War context in Yes Sir, No Sir, Some Other Son deals with the death of a soldier, specifically Arthur's brother. This is, thankfully in my view, not explicitly made clear in the lyrics of the song, but instead in the album's liner notes. As ever, this affords the song a broader interpretation, pertaining perhaps to any soldier anywhere. While it is, of course, a Kinks song written and recorded in 1969, it successfully invokes a sepia-toned, early 20th century old world, not just through its stately harpsichord and dominant and lush use of strings, but of course through the song's music and lyrics.
Two soldiers fighting in a trench. One soldier glances up to see the sun and dreams of games he played when he was young. And then his friend calls out his name. He stops his dreams, and when he turns his head, a second later he is dead.
I personally get carried away with Some Other Son's emotional pull. Something about the First World War in particular really strikes a chord with me and chimes with my own pacifism, mostly due to the utter pointlessness of that conflict in particular and the outsized destruction it caused. Young, working-class men being sent out to die for a patch of land that would no doubt be taken back the following day. And that sentiment set to such a beautiful set of chords, not unlike Yes Sir, No Sir, also in that its harmonic shifts make the sequence flow so naturally, as if it somehow writes itself. Makes for a perfect match of music and lyrics. They put his picture on the wall. They put the flowers in the picture frame. Some mother's memory remains. Just as Ray does all over Village Green, he's talking about the human tendency to embody our memories into everyday objects. Some mother's son is now frozen in a picture frame. But without her memory, it's as if he may as well have never existed at all. Inspired by the countryside driving expeditions of the Davies family in Ray and Dave's youth, Drivin is exactly what it says in the tin. It's a song about driving. Within the context of Arthur, it's not only a tonal gear shift, but it represents a respite for its characters, a slice of simple working class escapism, presumably set on the cusp of the Second World War.
It seems like all the world is fighting. They're even talking of the war.
To my ears, the way the dorky sing-along leading into the minor key beginning of the verse is a throwback to the Kinks of yesteryear, the black and white privations of Dead End Street or Big Black Smoke from the Face-to-Face era. Evoking the theme of the song, it contains some nifty guitar work from Dave, including a very nice little run up and down in the chorus, as well as some multi-tracked percussion work from Mick to provide some extra texture to what is, in all fairness, an otherwise fairly repetitive and simplistic song, by design of course. A slightly underwhelming choice for a single in my opinion, although I suspect a lot of Kinks heads will disagree with that assessment. John Lennon was notably a fan of this song, someone who, like Ray, was a notoriously bad driver, ironically enough. The proto-punk early period Kinks are back with Brainwashed, a live favourite and a riff rock rave up to boot. Lots of fun, this one. It's about nonconformity and in a meta sense reflects the Kinks' nonconformity in the context of flower power and heavy blues rock, as well as a small c conservatism reflected in Ray's lyrics more broadly, seemingly at odds with the radicalism of the hippie zeitgeist, as well as the hand-wringing, liberal equivocating of John Lennon in the song Revolution. Lennon is in, and then he's out, whereas Ray is decidedly out from day one. He's having none of it. In Arthur, it's clearly about reaching middle age, the middle ground, the middle of the road, and the materialism that comes with it. You've got a job and a house and a wife and your kids and your car. Yeah, you're conditioned to think what they want you to think and be happy to be where you are. Structurally, it's like Yes Sir, No Sir in that it neatly runs through a verse and chorus before coming to a halt, where we're treated to some garage rock riffin'. While it thoroughly rocks along with its primitive major chords, Ray can't help but throw in a couple of bars of his signature descending minor key melancholy as well.
All your life they kicked you around and pushed you around till you can't take anymore.
It then returns to the song proper for the final verse and chorus, lyrically going into that bureaucratic specificity that Ray would later make a feature of on the Muswell Hillbillies album. They give you social security, tax-saving benefits that grow at maturity. Nobody writes lyrics like this. Closing out side one is Australia, Arthur's longest track at nearly 7 minutes and the point in the story where Arthur's kids decide to flee the motherland for the island paradise of the Antipodes. I feel uniquely qualified to comment on the topic of this song, especially as an Australian living in the UK, who is consistently asked 3 things whenever someone clocks my accent. Firstly, they say, "Isn't everyone from there racist?" To which I say, well, sort of, yeah. Although, in all fairness, post the EU referendum vote, I get that question far less than I used to. The second thing people say is, "Oh, I would never live somewhere with so many poisonous things." To which I typically say, well, I've never been stung by anything dangerous. In fact, growing up in regional Victoria, I've never even seen a snake in my life. Which is, in all fairness, a white lie. And finally, and the question I get asked most frequently, and is pertinent to the song, is why on earth would you actively choose to live here rather than there? Which is an amusing question to me. Firstly, because most Brits' experience of hot countries is while on holiday, not day-to-day living. Imagine going to work, carrying your shopping home, or weeding the garden, but you are the hottest you've ever been in your life. That's Australia. Secondly, public transport is poor, it's hugely disconnected from the rest of the world physically and culturally, and the politics, while different, is just another slightly different flavour of batshit like anywhere else. I will say in Australia's defence that the standard of living is crazily high, disproportionately so. But that's what you get for basing your entire economy on digging stuff out of the ground and selling it to China. But of course, Ray Davies knows all of these things too, as the song Australia on this record is clearly tongue-in-cheek. I love how it almost sounds like a corny tourist ad, projecting this idealised vision in these demented, corny voices. Nobody has to be any better than what they want to be. It's hilarious, but as ever, Ray can't help but really sell the fantasy with some beautiful chord changes.
Like they do in the USA. We'll fly down to Sydney for a holiday on sunny Christmas Day. Australia.
Some other rather unlikely and lofty claims made about Australia in the lyrics of this song include: opportunities are available for all walks of life. Dubious at best. Nobody's got a chip on their shoulder. You sure about that one, Ray? Nobody hesitates with life or beats around the bush. Citation needed, mate. Jokes aside, a lot of people consider Australia the weak spot on Arthur, but I think it's great. It's got some great lead vocal work from Dave in the verses. The solo piano breakdown and the sweeping horns are enough to make a patriot out of me. And the nearly 4-minute jam section at the end, because of and not in spite of its lack of instrumental virtuosity, is really groovy and enjoyable for me. It's certainly weird for a Kinks song from almost any angle, and perhaps is there to serve the narrative more than any other on Arthur. Ray's ode to Arthur's Pebble Dash Nirvana, the epic Shangri-La, is the centerpiece of this album, and due to Ray having written so many outstanding songs in his career, that on writing this, I had actually forgotten myself that I had long considered this my very favourite Kinks song. And in all fairness, it probably still is. The delicate opening acoustic guitar pulls us in through the window of this Shangri-La to find Arthur on his throne, surveying his glorious suburban paradise from his settee by the fire, with his pipe and slippers. But from his position of contentment, we start to hear his swirling thoughts, the critical voice asking him what he has perhaps sacrificed or otherwise lost in the pursuit of the middle-class bourgeois dream. The introduction of the song provides this setting, alongside a stately hint of brass band in the backing. And as the song begins proper, we're also treated to some harpsichord. Dave's high harmony enters alongside his brothers in the verse, as we chronicle Arthur's rise up the rat race ranks and the modern middle-class trappings that come along with it. This section of the song runs through twice with ever busier instrumentation and a rousing sing-along chorus before the song seemingly ends just at under 2 minutes. Then with a burst of compressed power pop acoustic guitar, we're taken into an entirely new section. Almost as if the narration has been taken up by the evil half of Arthur's Jekyll and Hyde psyche. Suddenly we're noticing all that is vapid and superficial in his hard fought-for world over a compelling descending chord pattern.
All the houses in the street have got a name, 'cause all the houses in the street, they look the same. Same chimney pots, same little cars, same window panes.
Arthur is simultaneously also realising that the people in his neighbourhood are like supporting actors in a grimly predictable play, non-player characters, walking, talking, doing whatever it is they do to keep this Truman Show illusion of happiness ticking along. All the while Ray is switching between points of view so that he is at different moments talking about Arthur as well as me and you. Because for all intents and purposes, we are all trapped together in the same rat race.
The gas bills and the water rates, the payments on the car. Too scared to think about how insecure you are. Laughing so happy in your little Shangri-La. Shangri-La, la 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 la.
At this point, the sing-along becomes almost demented, like we've all drunk the Kool-Aid, kicking our legs, arm in arm, la-la-la-ing our heads off with our blinkers on and fingers in our ears. After this crescendo, we are slowly brought back down for an epic final verse, with the same lyrics as the first. And the song comes to a glorious, triumphant, and celebratory end, as if to say, yes, it was after all worth it in the end, and Arthur, and your contentment is well deserved after all. Shangri-La is the outcome of Arthur's life and the world, the physical manifestation of both the British Empire's failure and success. Mr. Churchill Says is also something of a pocket-sized epic, in spite of its unassuming a cappella introduction. Like Yes Sir, No Sir, its modest rhythmic lope reflects its lyrics' subservient theme, and it is similarly political in that your average Joe, or average Arthur in this case, is yet again being asked to sacrifice something for the war effort, this time of course being World War II. Media mogul Lord Beaverbrook, Field Marshal Montgomery, Lord Mountbatten, and Vera Lynn all get name checks in the lyrics, and Ray even shifts into the character of wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself before the second, more propulsive section of the song kicks off, to the sound of air raid sirens. And I'm certainly gripped with a strange, unknowable fear whenever I hear that sound, like a dog's instinctive fear of fireworks or something. The jazzy guitar solo offers up a lovely bit of minor key, Eastern-tinged flavour, giving way to a drums and vocal clap-along, sing-along breakdown.
Well, Mr. Churchill says we gotta hold up our chins, we gotta show some courage and some discipline. Gotta black up the windows and nail up the doors, and keep right on till the end of the war.
And unlike the other more expansive, progressively structured tracks on Arthur, it fades out before the song has the chance to return to its original form with a third verse. The almost over-the-top, stately harpsichord signals the satirical nature of She's Bought a Hat Like Princess Marina, a multi-genre music hall pastiche sung by Ray in a mock, posh accent. For those who don't know, I certainly didn't until I had to write this, Princess Marina was a Greek and Danish princess who married into the British royal family through her 1934 marriage to Prince George, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of King George V and Queen Mary. That's about all the royal chat I think I can handle. Which is just as well, because rather than taking the mickey out of the royals, it's clearly a playful dig at the aspirational classes, who emulate the sartorial trappings of their apparent social betters. Perhaps in Arthur's world at least, partly a luxury afforded to members of his family as a result of his hard graft over the years, but moreover, as made clear in the lyric, it's more of an escapist fantasy than anything else for the characters in the song. Even outside of the album, it's the kind of daft, Kinksian novelty song that might fit just about anywhere in their catalogue, providing a moment of levity if nothing else. I quite like the way it cycles from being a Noel Coward parlour song to a conventional rocker and then into a trad jazz section featuring kazoos, banjos and some impressive snare drum chops from Mick Avery. Not a million miles away from what the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band might do. Psychedelic in only a way the Kinks and the Bonzos could really be. Princess Marina is certainly an odd one. Young and Innocent Days is the kind of Kinks song I would associate with their next album, Lola vs. Powerman, and the band's transitional interim period between Arthur and the country-tinged confidence of Muswell Hillbillies. And I mean that in the sense it's a quite affecting, slower-paced, yearning ballad, the chorus of which really relies on Dave's high harmony vocal part. The chord progression is another of those beautiful, natural descending Davis creations that seems to write itself.
I wish my eyes could only see everything exactly as it used to be. It's too late, so late. Young and innocent days.
You could argue it's something of a response to John Lennon's In My Life, thematically at least, although in all fairness, about half of all Ray's songs are about the sadness of time passing after all. Certainly within Arthur, it's fairly easy to interpret it as the character looking back fondly on his youth, back when the world wasn't so corrupted by greed and we were part of this grand empire upon which the sun never set. Mostly piano and harpsichord driven, I am surprised not to hear the horns utilised in the grand and majestic middle instrumental section of the song, which is nonetheless lovely, and the extended arpeggiated acoustic guitar coda really drives home the song's delicate melodicism. We pick things up with a bit of energy towards the end of the album, starting with Nothing to Say. But this is an illusion, as the song's piano-driven jauntiness masks a rather devastating lyric once again. The words of Arthur's now adult son back to his father. Remember walking with you by my side. You were my papa, I was your pride. And now I got children and I'm going grey. No time for talking, I got nothing to say. Basically saying, as a result of going through the same trials and tribulations of life, they have in a sense so much in common that there is little need to communicate anything at all. And not in a perhaps comfortable silence kind of way, but sadly more in a I'd rather not spend any time with you anymore sort of way. Perhaps a sentiment shared by many parents who end up the very victims of the independence and autonomy they so drilled into their offspring. Even if it's hard to discern the final beat of Arthur's story as far as the mooted television program was concerned, on the album it's a sad way to close out his story, although it could also be viewed as a cyclical return to the beginning, in the sense that all the sadness and beauty of life is universal, and we have no other option than to keep calm and carry on. Again, Ray isn't overtly passing comment, he is merely presenting the world as he sees it and asking us to pull out our own meaning. Other than that, my only other thoughts on this song are the minor key bridge section where I can't seem to decide if it's Ray or Dave singing. Probably Dave, as he tends to have more grit in his voice. Like a victory lap, or more fittingly, the closing credits of a film or television show, Arthur's actual theme song closing the album acts as a potted plot synopsis, recapping his modest beginning, his climb up the ladder in pursuit of his Shangri-La, and finally his children growing up and moving away, and with it his whole world, all leaving him, the everyman, behind. About as musically heavy as things get on Arthur other than Brainwashed, and strikes a cheery tone that is both parts celebratory of Arthur and his empire, micro or macro, and optimistic for what the future holds, for him, for you, and for me. The Kinks are proud to fly the flag for Arthur, the little guy, the downtrodden, the left behind. Somebody loves you, don't you know it?
If only life were easy, it would be such fun. Whoa. Things will be more equal, there'll be plenty for everyone.
Dave playing on this track in particular is a joy. Very Harrison-esque in its thoughtful, Chet Atkins-inspired country pick and twang. And it naturally calls ahead to the far more studied country approach of Muswell Hillbillies a few albums later. As the song enters its fade-out, the group vocals and hand claps come to dominate more and more of the mix, and Arthur, an album about a humble average Joe at the mercy of the system, comes to a humble close, with no more fanfare than as it began. Now as for the artwork, Arthur was released literally the same week as Monty Python's Flying Circus had its television debut. So I imagine any similarity between Terry Gilliam's cutout animation for that show and Bob Laurie's design for Arthur is pure coincidence. Either way, I personally really love the style, and it screams Britain in 1969, as far as I'm concerned. And it's nice to think there was a degree of aesthetic synergy in the culture at the time, for what it's worth. Having finally negotiated an agreement with the American Federation of Musicians Union to end the Kinks' US touring ban, the release of Arthur set the stage for the Kinks' American comeback. And in all fairness, Arthur sold reasonably well stateside, certainly better than in their homeland. Victoria was the album's most successful single in both markets, peaking at 62 in the US and 30 in the UK. Critically, it was similarly far more highly regarded in the States. The tour, however, did not go particularly well, but they almost by accident regained a foothold in the US with the surprise success of 1970's Lola vs. Power Man and the Money Go Round, especially its hit single Lola. The half of this album that I really love. Strangers is Dave's greatest achievement as a songwriter, and This Time Tomorrow and A Long Way From Home can still bring a tear to my cynical eye. All the satirical, bitchy songs about how much Ray hates the music industry, however, are garbage for the most part, in my opinion. All in all, a transitional album. In 1971, they did the soundtrack to Percy, a rather demented sex comedy about a penis transplant. God's Children is a lovely song from this, but it's not really substantial as a standalone album. Towards the end of the same year, the Kinks' golden era came to a spectacular close with their 10th album, the classic Muswell Hillbillies. Intended as their country album, it's also equal parts music hall, trad jazz, and mid-tempo, hard-driving 70s rock. It was also deliberately all recorded with vintage mics, giving it a very specific, smoky atmosphere, and is otherwise dominated by the horns of the Mike Cotton sound. Definitely worth checking out for those who don't know it. Of the 14 albums released between 1972 and their eventual breakup in 1994, I'm only slightly ashamed to admit that I've barely heard any of them. I can't think of many other bands I adore anywhere near as much as I adore the Kinks, who also have such a large part of their catalogue that so disinterests me. Possibly the Rolling Stones, or the Beach Boys maybe. The song Celluloid Heroes is really the only thing I can think of. Mega fans will not be impressed by that, of course, but hey, I'm not going to lie to you. Their mid-70s theatrical era is for the most part pretty camp and embarrassing, and the atmosphere within the band was all pretty toxic as well. More toxic than usual, I should say, reaching a grim crescendo when Ray announced the end of the Kinks from the stage at White City in 1973, before subsequently collapsing from a drug overdose. Recovering from that, over the next decade, they gradually rebuilt a large following in the USA, touring endlessly and putting out albums of mixed quality. On the commercial downward slope yet again, the Kinks soldiered on and enjoyed a period of elder statesman adoration during the Britpop years of the 1990s, before eventually calling it quits. Learning more about the details of the band's last 2 decades rather than the actual music, again mostly through the book A Complicated Life by Johnny Rogan, what really struck me was just how completely toxic the atmosphere really was within the Kinks, basically for their entire existence. And not just the constant bickering between Ray and Dave, which is bitterly hilarious, but also how they treated the people around them, including within the band. Ray was famous for publicly dressing down members of the band, not for any sort of infraction, but as a matter of course. Dave's mostly drug and alcohol-fueled mental disintegration over the years also came with its fair share of cruelty. One anecdote that sticks out to me is him walking across the stage to their then bass player, Andy Pyle, kicking him in the shin and screaming in his ear to demand that he deliberately play the wrong note, just for the sake of embarrassing him in front of thousands of fans. These poor musicians, who for years toiled in the band, usually earning a fraction of what the brothers did, represent yet another Kinks Oasis parallel. But it's easy to forget this is more than a band. This is a family. And that's what families are like, at least some of them. And to be honest, would I be willing to take a regular verbal bollocking, as well as perhaps the odd physical one, to be able to play a part in making this wonderful, wonderful music? Yeah, I probably would. Because it all comes back to the songs. The Sturm und Drang of musical virtuosity loses its shine through repetition, in my experience. But can one ever really tire of the visceral simplicity of Till the End of the Day, the austere romance of Waterloo Sunset, or the majesty of Shangri-La? In many ways, the Kinks are proof that pop music really is the best kind of music. Styles come and go, as it did for them. But at the end of the day, or till the end of the day, a good song is a good song, and the Kinks had loads and loads of good songs, more than most, maybe more than anyone. Pop music is, in many ways, the best music because it conveys complex human emotion in a simplistic way. This is literally the reason why everybody likes the Beatles. Their lyrics are pap. You instead feel their songs. People who can't speak English understand the meaning of Beatles songs just as much as you or I do. Such is the magic of pop. In an alternate universe, where the Kinks are given their due and are universally adored, you would easily say the same about them. And at risk of getting all kumbaya, teach the world to sing about it, something Ray himself would no doubt hate, it can't be denied that music does have the power to cross divides and unite us in a common humanity. And for millennials like me, it's more than a bit frightening to look at the ever-looming spectre of climate change rumbling towards us, not to mention war and political destabilization in the West particularly, and not feel a pang of fear that the beauty of the natural world as well as our common humanity might be all swept away in a heartbeat. More than anything, seeing the world through this lens puts the 20th century, particularly the second half of it, obviously, into particular perspective. Because all of these things, the value of love and community, in fact are and always were extremely fragile, and we could easily wake up tomorrow with it all gone. And that's all that Ray was ever really talking about, even then. And I can't help but feel, especially as I get older, that Ray's view of the world, at least that expressed through his songs, for the most part, chimes with mine. Firstly, his observation of people imbues their lives with an inherent value. Terry and Julie meet at Waterloo Station, presumably because they are young and in love and full of hope for the future. We watch them like we do the countless other faces that flash past us every day, safe in the knowledge that everybody is the central character in their own lives, and are motivated largely by the same things we are all motivated by. Material things, yes, but more importantly, our connections with other humans in the moment. I, for one, certainly can get very misty-eyed about half-imagined, idealized views of the past. But when we smile at each other, laugh together, or even do nothing at all in each other's company, that is then, in the moment, the living of our lives, and no number of photographs or other forms of documentation are going to prevent time itself from taking that away, eventually. Arthur's story is not exceptional. Ray is simply asking us to consider it precisely because it isn't. The small man against the big world is everybody's story, and one that Ray has told again and again throughout the Kinks' career. He's inviting us to empathise with the everyman or every person because we are all the every person. We are both the centre of the universe and the super special important snowflakes, as well as being completely insignificant. The universe is, of course, indifferent, but while we're here, we still have each other. God save the Kinks.